Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the Scottish Highlands, ancient Scotland, Fairy Hills of the Highlands. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The sky above Skehallion is the colour of cold ash. It is the hour before first light, somewhere around the 4th century, and the mountain stands exactly as it stands now, a quartzite cone rising to 724 metres above the valley floor. Nothing moves on its upper slopes. The frost has come in overnight, settling on the bare rock, whitening the short grasses that grow in the thin soil just below the summit ridge. Down in the valley of the River Tummel, the water is running fast and black between its banks. The Tummel carries snowmelt from the high ground to the west. It has been doing so since the ice retreated, cutting its course through the schist and the sandstone over thousands of years. The river is narrow here, perhaps 12 meters bank to bank in a dry season, but the spring thaw has widened it. The near bank is soft, dark, pressed flat by the weight of water that moved across it only weeks ago. A heron stands at the edge, absolutely still, waiting. To the north and west, the ridgelines of the Grampian Massif are beginning to separate themselves from the sky. They do it slowly. The darkness does not so much lift as thin, becoming a deep grey, then a lighter grey along the eastern horizon toward the Cairngorms. The summits of Bain, a GHLO, are the first shapes to become distinct. 3 peaks running roughly northeast to southwest, their flanks covered in heather moorland and old scree. At this hour they are silhouettes, nothing more. The smell in the valley is of cold water and wet peat. The peat underlies almost everything here. It has been building for 4,000 years, layer upon compacted layer of sphagnum moss and sedge, and the slow rot of vegetation. In places, it is 2 meters deep. It holds the moisture of the whole upland system, releasing it gradually into the burns and rills that feed the Tummel and the Tay. Walking on it, even in dry summer months, a person's foot sinks slightly with each step. This early in the morning, it is frozen at the surface, crisp underfoot, the individual sphagnum hummocks made rigid by the night cold. Closer to the river, where the ground levels and the soil deepens, there is a settlement. It does not announce itself. There are no walls of stone visible from a distance, no tower, no track wide enough to be seen from the ridge above. It is a cluster of roundhouses, perhaps 6 of them, set on slightly raised ground above the flood line of the Tummel. The houses are circular in plan, each one between 8 and 12 meters in diameter. Their walls are of timber post and wattle, packed with a mixture of clay and chopped grass. The roofs are steeply pitched, thatched with marsh reed cut from the river margins, and they come down low, almost to shoulder height at the eaves. The largest of these structures has a doorway facing southeast. This is not by accident. Southeast catches the earliest light of the day and places the prevailing wind at the back of the opening. The door itself is a framed hurdle of woven hazel, hung on a wooden peg. It is closed now. Inside, the central hearth has burned low. It has not gone out. The hearth in a house of this kind is rarely allowed to go out entirely. The ash of it holds heat for many hours, and a buried ember, fed with dry fuel in the morning, can be coaxed back into flame without the effort of making fire from scratch. The smoke from that hearth has no chimney to escape through. It rises through the thatch itself, filtering out through the reed in a slow, invisible seep. In dry weather, you might smell a settlement of this kind before you see it. The smoke of a peat and wood fire is specific, low and heavy, not the sharp, clean smell of softwood, but something older and earthier. Mixed with it, at this hour, is the smell of the cattle. There are cattle sheltered inside the outer ring of the largest roundhouse, in a byre space separated from the main living area by a low wicker partition. They are small animals by later standards, dark-coated, with short curved horns. They have been inside since the first hard frost of autumn. The people sleeping in these houses are not numerous. A community of this size along the Tummel Valley in the 4th century might number 30 to 40 individuals, spread across 2 or 3 family groups. They are sleeping now, close together, on platforms of timber and bracken set around the inner wall of the roundhouse. The bracken serves as both insulation and bedding. It is changed several times a year when it becomes damp or infested. The sleepers are wrapped in wool. The wool is woven not in any fine or elaborate way, but tightly in a plain weave that traps air and sheds water. The natural lanolin of the fleece has not been entirely removed in the washing, which gives the cloth a faint waxy quality that adds to its resistance to rain. Outside, the first sounds of the coming day are beginning. A curlew calls from somewhere on the moor above the settlement. It is a long, descending call, unmistakable. The curlew has been a bird of Scottish uplands since long before any human settlement existed here, and its call carries across open ground with remarkable clarity in still air. After the curlew, there is a period of complete silence. Then the river becomes audible again, its low, constant sound reasserting itself now that the wind has dropped to nothing in the last hour before dawn. The hills to the east are now faintly visible as shapes distinct from the sky. Along the upper valley of the Tay, some 20 kilometers to the southeast, the same lightening is taking place. The Tay is a larger river than the Tummel, running broader and slower through the strath. Its banks in this period are lined with alder and willow where the ground is wet, and with birch and rowan on the higher, stonier terraces. There are other settlements along the Tay, other roundhouses, other low hearth fires going cold in the last of the night. The communities along this river system are connected to one another, though the connections are loose and seasonal. There are paths through the valley that follow the natural contours of the land. They are not paved. They are pressed earth, worn clear of vegetation by generations of use, wide enough for a single person or a small animal to move along without difficulty. The path that leads north from the Tummel settlement climbs quickly onto open moorland. Within 200 meters of the last roundhouse, it has left the birchwood behind and entered a landscape of heather and cotton grass and bare wet rock. In the summer months, this moor carries cattle and sheep. The animals are moved up onto the high ground in late spring and brought back down before the first autumn storms. This practice of transhumance, of moving livestock between valley pastures and summer grazings on the upland, shapes the rhythm of the entire year for the people living here. In the 4th century, the upland grazings of the Central Highlands are extensive. There are no fences. The boundaries between one community's grazing land and another's are understood, held in memory, marked occasionally by a distinctive rock or the course of a burn. On the lower slopes of Schiehallion itself, where the heather gives way to the upper grasslands, there are signs of earlier occupation. There are clearance cairns on some of the valley-facing terraces, small piles of stone gathered from fields that were worked in the Bronze Age, centuries before the people sleeping now in the roundhouses below were born. The cairns are mossy now, half settled into the turf. The fields they once cleared are no longer cultivated. The soil at this altitude is thin and acid, and the climate has been cooling gradually since the mid-2nd millennium before the Common Era. What was marginal farmland in the Bronze Age has become, by the 4th century, reliably too poor and too cold to be worth breaking with a plough. The ploughs in use in the valley below are light ard ploughs, sometimes called scratch ploughs. They do not turn the soil as a later moldboard plough will do. They score it, breaking the surface, creating a series of parallel channels through which seed can be dropped. The ard is pulled by a pair of oxen. The oxen are worked animals, valued above cattle, kept only for meat or milk, fed through the winter on hay cut, and dried in late summer from the water meadows along the river. The hay is stacked inside or immediately adjacent to the roundhouses, under a roof of thatch or turf supported on timber poles. The fields cultivated by the settlement along the Tummel are small. They are cut into the lower valley slopes where the soil has some depth and the gradient is manageable. They are bounded by low earthen banks, irregular in shape, following the land rather than imposing any grid upon it. In the 4th century, the principal crops grown in this part of the highlands are barley and emmer wheat. Barley is the more reliable of the two at this latitude and altitude. It has a shorter growing season and tolerates the acid soils better. The grain from the previous harvest is stored in small raised granaries, timber-framed structures set on 4 posts, their floors lifted clear of the ground to deter rodents and allow air to circulate. There is a quernstone inside the largest roundhouse, set near the doorway where the light is best. It is a rotary quern, two circular stones of gritty sandstone, each perhaps 40 centimeters in diameter. The upper stone has a wooden handle inserted into a hole near its rim. To grind grain, a person kneels or sits beside the quern and turns the upper stone by the handle, feeding grain through the central hole. It is slow work. To grind enough barley for a morning meal takes perhaps 20 minutes of steady turning. The grain is not refined. The flour it produces is coarse, grey-brown in color, gritty with fragments of stone from the quern itself. Mixed with water and set on a flat hearthstone, it makes a flatbread that is dense and filling and slightly smoky from the fire. The first person to wake in the settlement will be one of the older women. This is a general truth of the period and this kind of community, not a specific individual but a pattern. She will rise from the sleeping platform and move to the hearth. She will add fuel, probably a block of dried peat cut from the nearby bog the previous autumn, laid against the surviving embers. The peat is dark brown and dense. It burns slowly, giving off more heat than light, a low steady warmth that fills the interior of the roundhouse over the course of an hour. While the fire builds, she will go to the door and open it. At the moment the hurdle door swings open, the cold air comes in from outside and the warm air from the cattle moves in the other direction, a brief exchange. The sky to the east is now visibly pale, a thin wash of light running along the ridge above the Tay Valley. The hills are no longer silhouettes. Their shapes have texture now, the darker lines of the burns cutting down through the heather. The pale scree runs on the higher faces of Bain, a GHLO. The birchwood along the river showing the fine grey tracery of its bare winter branches. The settlement sits in this light without drama. The thatched roofs are grey with frost. The ground between the roundhouses is dark mud, worn hard by daily passage. There is a stack of timber against the outer wall of the byre, split lengths of birch and alder, enough for several more days of fire. Beside it, a wooden trough has collected rainwater overnight. The surface of the water in the trough is frozen, a disk of thin ice, opaque and white. The woman from the doorway will come to this trough in a few minutes and break the ice with the heel of her hand, and the day will properly begin. The river below the settlement is moving steadily east, carrying the cold water of the high ground down toward the Tay and eventually to the sea at the Firth. It has been doing this through the entire night, indifferent to the frost and the darkness. The heron has not moved. It stands on the near bank in the first grey light, its neck folded down between its shoulders, watching the shallow water at the river's edge. Somewhere in the birchwood above the flood line, a wren begins to call. It is a sharp, fast, mechanical call, entirely disproportionate to the size of the bird that makes it. The wren falls silent. The river continues, the light in the east. The sky above Strathnayan is the color of cold ash. It is early morning, sometime around 4,000 years before the present era. The hills to the east hold the last of the darkness. The glen below is still. A thin curl of smoke rises from a roundhouse near the river bank. Someone inside has been awake for a while already. The roundhouse is built from timber posts driven into the ground in a circle roughly 10 meters across. The walls are wattle, woven from hazel rods cut the previous autumn. Daub made from clay, animal dung, and chopped straw has been pressed into the weave. It has dried hard over the summer and keeps most of the wind out. The roof is a steep cone of thatch, laid thick with heather and river reed. A single low doorway faces southeast, away from the prevailing wind. Inside, the floor is packed earth. Near the center, a hearth of flat stones holds a fire that has burned through the night. The smoke finds its way out through the thatch slowly, and the interior always carries a faint gray haze near the roof line. Around the walls, sleeping platforms are raised slightly from the floor on timber frames. Animal hides cover them. The people sleeping there lie under cloaks of woven wool. The wool is coarse and undyed, the color of the sheep themselves, which is a brownish gray. The first person standing is a woman in her middle years. She wears a length of woolen cloth wrapped and pinned at the shoulder with a bone pin. Her feet are bare on the earth floor. She moves to the hearth and adds dry birch wood from a pile stacked just inside the door. The fire takes quickly. She has a clay pot already sitting at the edge of the hearthstones. It was placed there last night with water and cracked grain inside. By morning, the grain has softened and the water is already warm from the residual heat. She pushes the pot closer to the flame. The grain is emmer wheat and hulled barley, grown in small rectangular fields on the lower slopes just above the flood plain. Those fields were broken with a simple ard, a pointed wooden implement pulled by a pair of oxen. The ard does not turn the soil the way a later plough would. It scratches a furrow into the ground. The same ground is scratched again at a right angle. The seed is pressed in by hand. The harvest was brought in by stone-bladed sickle and stored in a raised granary built on 4 timber posts, which keeps the grain dry and away from rodents. The porridge is the first food of the day. It is thick and unseasoned by any spice. Hazelnuts gathered from the woodland above the settlement are sometimes added. Wild garlic from the riverbank is used when it is in season. The people eat from shallow wooden bowls, using their fingers or a flat wooden spatula. There is no salt at this settlement this morning. Salt is a traded good and does not arrive regularly. When it does come, it comes from the coast, carried inland over long distances by foot. Outside, the light has shifted. The ash color is lifting toward pale gray. The hills to the southeast are beginning to separate themselves from the sky. A dog moves in the gap between 2 roundhouses and lies down again near a midden heap. The midden holds broken pottery, animal bone, ash, and butchery waste. It has been building since the settlement was established, perhaps 30 years ago. The bones in the lower layers are already pressed flat by the weight above them. The men of the settlement are waking now. There are perhaps 6 adult men living in this cluster of 4 roundhouses. They are shorter on average than a modern person, but not by a great margin. Their diet has been adequate, though not abundant. They wear tunics of woven wool reaching to mid-thigh. Over the tunic, when working outside in cold weather, a heavier cloak is pinned at the chest. Their footwear is simple leather, cut from a single piece of hide and gathered at the ankle with a leather thong. This style of shoe has been in use in the region for many centuries already. The first trade of the morning belongs to the flint worker. He is a younger man, perhaps 18 years of age. He sits near the doorway of his roundhouse to catch the growing light. In front of him, on a flat stone, he has a nodule of flint brought from a coastal deposit some distance to the northeast. Flint does not occur naturally in the Central Highlands. Every piece has been carried here. It is therefore worked carefully and nothing is wasted. Small blades, scrapers, and points are produced from each nodule with great economy. He holds the flint nodule in one hand, wrapped in a scrap of leather to protect his palm. In the other hand, he holds a rounded hammerstone selected from the river bed for its particular weight and hardness. He strikes the edge of the nodule at a precise angle. A long, thin flake detaches. He examines it without expression and sets it aside. This flake will become a scraper used to clean fat and membrane from animal hides. The process of removing flakes in sequence to produce a usable edge is called knapping. He has been doing this since he was a child, watching an older man do the same. Across the settlement, another man is working with wood. He has a section of oak trunk, roughly split along the grain, with wooden wedges driven by a rounded stone maul. The grain of oak runs relatively straight when the tree is young, and a skilled worker can split a section cleanly without a metal tool. He is shaping a new handle for a digging implement. The blade of that implement is a flat piece of red deer antler perforated at one end to receive the handle. Antler is hard and dense enough to break ground when driven by hand. Deer are present in large numbers on the hillsides above the settlement. They are hunted with a bow. The bow is made from a single stave of yew, which grows in sheltered gullies on the lower slopes. Yew heartwood and sapwood have different properties under tension and compression, and the natural combination in a single stave makes for an efficient bow. The string is twisted sinew. The arrows are thin shafts of hazel or ash, fletched with bird feathers bound by fine sinew thread. The arrowhead is a small triangular piece of flint, hafted into a split at the end of the shaft and bound tight. A woman near the second roundhouse is working at a loom. The loom is a warp-weighted type. Vertical threads hang from a horizontal beam supported between two upright posts. At the bottom of each group of warp threads, a small clay weight holds them taut. The weaver passes a shuttle of weft thread horizontally through the warp and beats it upward with a flat bone comb. The resulting cloth is simple in weave structure, but dense and warm. A finished piece large enough to make a cloak takes several weeks of work. The thread itself was spun earlier in the season using a drop spindle, a small weighted wooden shaft that draws and twists raw wool fiber into thread as it turns under its own momentum. The sheep providing that wool are small animals, not much like the breeds familiar in a later period. They are closer to the Soay type, short-tailed, brown-fleeced, and semi-wild in behavior. They graze on the hillside above the settlement and are brought down to a small timber enclosure at night. They are not shorn with metal shears. Instead, the wool is plucked by hand during the natural molt in early summer, when it loosens from the fleece of its own accord. This process is called ruing, and it has been practiced in the islands and highlands of Scotland for a very long time. The cattle kept at the settlement are also small by later standards. They are a short-horned type descended from the wild aurochs, which has been domesticated in Britain for several centuries already. The cattle provide milk, which is consumed directly or allowed to sour and thicken. They provide hides when slaughtered in autumn before the hard feeding of winter. They provide traction for the ard in ploughing season. They are walked from the settlement pasture each morning and brought back at dusk. A boy of perhaps 10 years is responsible for watching them on the hill through the day. The river running along the base of the glen is shallow and clear in summer. By early morning in the warmer months, fish are visible in the pools below the small rapids. The fish are brown trout and Atlantic salmon on their way upstream. A man from the settlement stands at the edge of a pool with a wicker trap, a cylindrical basket woven from willow withes, open at one end and narrowing inside so that a fish which enters cannot easily reverse out. These traps are set the previous evening and checked at first light. This morning there are 2 trout in the trap. They are carried back to the settlement wrapped in wet grass. The woodland above and around the settlement is a mixed growth of birch, oak, hazel, alder along the wetter ground, and rowan on the higher slopes. It has been managed over generations. Hazel is coppiced, meaning it is cut close to the ground every few years to produce long, straight rods. These rods are used for wattle wall construction, for basket weaving, and for tool handles. The coppice stools, the root systems from which new growth springs, are perhaps decades old already. The woodland is not wilderness. It has been shaped by the people living in it. A woman and an older girl are working in the hazel coppice this morning. They have bone-handled flint blades, and they are cutting second-year rods of the right diameter for basket weaving. The rods are tied in bundles and carried back to the settlement over the shoulder. They will be soaked in the river to keep them pliable until they are needed. The same coppice was cut from a different section 2 years ago. The new growth from that section is already waist-high. The woodland rotates its yield in a pattern these people understand very well. Pottery is made at this settlement by one particular woman who has learned the technique from her mother. There is no potter's wheel in use here. Pots are built by the coil method, in which ropes of clay are wound upward and smoothed together to form the vessel wall. The clay comes from a deposit at the river bank, a grayish material that sits just below the turf line in a particular bend of the river. It is mixed with small stones or broken-fired pottery, called grog, to give it strength during firing. The finished pots are dried slowly in the air. before being fired in a simple open hearth at the edge of the settlement. The fired pots are plain in most cases, rounded in form with a slightly thickened rim. Some have simple impressed decoration around the shoulder, made by pressing a twisted cord into the wet clay before firing. This cord-impressed style is found across a wide area of Britain during this period. It is not a decoration that means something specific. It is a tradition carried in the hands of potters who learned it from those who came before them. The pots hold grain, water, rendered fat from slaughtered animals, and dried hazelnuts. They break easily and must be replaced often. The walk to the furthest fields from this settlement is about 20 minutes on foot across uneven ground. The lower fields are closest, on the gentle slope above the river bank. The higher fields are cut into the hillside on terraces supported by low stone and turf banks. These banks, called lynchets in a later vocabulary, accumulate over years as soil is displaced by the ard working across the slope. They are not deliberately constructed. They form themselves through the repeated action of cultivation. The people working these fields do not have a name for what they are. They are simply where the grain grows. A man working the upper field this morning carries an ard over his shoulder. The ard is a simple wooden implement, a pointed share attached to a short beam with a handle rising from it. It is not heavy, perhaps 4 or 5 kilograms. The oxen that will pull it are already tethered at the edge of the field. He fits the yoke across their necks, a straight timber piece tied with leather, and walks them to the end of the first furrow. The ground here has been worked before. Last season's stubble was burned off in the autumn. The ash is still visible in the pale soil. He leans into the handle, and the oxen step forward, and the point of the ard draws its first line through the morning ground. The light is now fully up over the eastern hills. The glen is visible in its entirety. The river reflects a pale sky. The roundhouses of the settlement sit on the low ground just above the flood plain, their thatched roofs dark with morning damp. Thin smoke rises from 3 of the 4 hearths. A dog barks once from somewhere near the midden. The boy watching the cattle is already a small figure on the hillside above, moving slowly upward behind the dark shapes of the animals. The flint worker has moved his flat stone back inside the doorway as the light strengthens. The sound of the hammerstone striking the nodule carries. The glen is already awake. It has been awake since before the light came over the ridge to the east. The cattle were moved at first grey, when the dew still sat thick on the grass, and the air carried the cold smell of the burn running fast over its stones. The men who moved them did so quietly, without hurry, because hurry was not part of how this work was done. The cattle themselves were small. They were the black, shaggy beasts that had grazed these upland pastures for centuries. Their horns were wide, and their coats were dense, grown thick against the wet winds that came down off the high ground for most of the year. A single township might hold 30 or 40 of these animals, distributed among the families who worked the land in common, each family knowing which beasts were theirs by the cut or mark made in the ear at birth. The land around the township was divided in a way that a visitor from the south would have found unfamiliar. There were no enclosed fields in the modern sense. The ground closest to the settlement was the infield. This was the land that received the dung, that was worked hardest, that produced the grain on which the people depended through the winter. Further out, where the soil thinned and the slope steepened, lay the outfield. The outfield was broken by the plough only every few years, cropped until its strength was gone, and then rested while the cattle grazed it back towards some kind of fertility. The plough at work in the infield was a simple thing. It was the cast-chrome, the foot plough, a long wooden shaft with an iron tip set at an angle near the lower end, and a wooden peg projecting sideways for the ploughman's right foot. A man worked alone with it. He drove the iron tip into the soil with the weight of his foot on the peg, levered the clod upward and to the side, moved half a step along, and did it again. The sound of that work was rhythmic and low. The iron scraped against stone sometimes. The turned earth made a soft collapse as each clod fell over. The man breathed steadily. He did not speak. Where the ground was broader and the slope allowed it, the heavier plough might be used. This was a wooden ard-type plough pulled by a team of small, tough garrans, the native Highland ponies. They were not large animals. They stood perhaps 13 hands, but they were strong for their size and they understood the work. The ploughman walked behind them, guiding the plough with both hands, calling to the horses in Gaelic when they needed to turn at the headland. The furrows they left were not deep. The Highland soil did not ask for deep ploughing. What it asked for was persistence. The principal grain crop in these glens was beara. Beara was a form of barley, hardy and fast ripening, suited to the short growing season of the upland north. It could be sown as late as May and still harvested before the autumn rains closed in. It was sown broadcast, the sower walking the infield with a sack or basket hung from one shoulder, throwing the grain in a wide arc to left and right with a practiced motion of the wrist. The sound of that was almost nothing. A soft hiss in the still morning air, and then the crows calling from the birch trees at the edge of the cleared ground. Oats were also grown, though they were considered the harder crop. They demanded more from the soil and returned less reliably in a poor summer. Yet they were the crop that fed the people directly, ground into meal and made into the porridge and flat bannocks that formed the basis of most meals in the glen. The oats were stored after harvest in the barn attached to the longhouse, in sacks or loose in a dry corner, and they were taken to the mill when the family had accumulated enough to make the journey worthwhile. The mill was not always close. In many Highland glens, the nearest horizontal mill sat at the foot of a burn where the gradient allowed a reliable head of water. The horizontal mill was simple in its construction. A wooden wheel lay flat beneath the millstone, its paddles set at an angle so that the falling water struck them and turned the whole assembly. There was no gearing. The millstone turned at the same speed as the wheel. The result was a coarser grind than the great vertical mills of the south, but it served well enough for oatmeal and bearer flour. The miller took his proportion of the grain as payment. This was called the multure. Every family in the township was bound to that mill and no other. The sound inside the mill was constant and loud. The water came down the timber laid with force. The wheel churned beneath the floor. The stone above it turned with a grinding hiss that filled the low building entirely. The miller stood near the hopper, feeding grain slowly so that it would not choke the eye of the stone. His clothes carried a fine white dust by midday. His hands were white with it. The floor around the stone was white with it. Even the low roof beams, dark with age and smoke from the small fire kept at one end of the building, were dusted white along their lower surfaces. Out on the hillside above the township, the women were cutting peat. This was not a marginal activity. This was the central fuel of Highland life. The peat banks lay above the tree line, on the broad shoulders of the hill, where the ground was wet and spongy underfoot, and the heather grew in long, unbroken stretches. The tool for cutting peat was the teaskia, a narrow, iron-bladed spade with a projecting wing on one side that cut the block clean on two faces at once. The cutter knelt or crouched at the bank face and drove the blade in horizontally, then levered the block out and tossed it back to a second person standing a step away. The blocks were left lying on the heather to dry. After some days they were stood on end, leaning against each other in small groups to let the wind pass through them. After more time, they were built into stacks. The stacks stood out against the skyline on clear days, darker brown than the heather around them, square and purposeful. By the time the nights began to lengthen in August, the peat would be dry enough to carry down. It was carried in creels, large wicker baskets worn on the back and supported by a strap across the forehead. A loaded creel was heavy. The path down from the peat bank was uneven and wet in places. Beside the work of the fields and the hill, there was the work of the loom. In the longhouse, set back from the door, where the light fell best from the single small window, the upright loom stood. The wool had been prepared over the previous months. It had been sheared from the sheep in June, washed in the burn, teased apart by hand, combed with iron-toothed cards until it was soft and even, and then spun on the drop spindle or the simple wheel into a continuous thread. The spinning was done in the evening or in any quiet moment between other tasks. The thread accumulated slowly. The weaving was slower still. The warp threads were set up on the loom with care, measured and tensioned evenly. The weft thread was passed through on the shuttle, a small boat-shaped piece of wood with the thread wound around a central pin. After each pass of the shuttle, the weft was beaten down firmly with the beater. A flat wooden bar hung from the top of the loom frame. The sound of weaving was a repeating sequence. The shuttle passed through with a whisper. The beater came down with a dull knock. The foot moved on the treadle to change the shed. Then again, then again. The cloth produced in this way was heavy and dense. It was woven plain or in a simple checked pattern using threads of different natural colors. The undyed brown and gray of the fleece mixed with threads colored with plant dyes made from lichen, bracken, or the bark of alder trees growing along the burn. This cloth became the plaid, a length of material perhaps 5 yards long and 2 yards wide, which served as both garment and blanket. A man wrapped it around his waist and belted it, letting the upper portion hang loose or be gathered over one shoulder. The leather workers in the glen were not specialists in the way a lowland cobbler might be. Every household cured its own hides to some degree, stretching the skin on a wooden frame, scraping it clean with an iron blade, working it with oak bark and urine until it had softened and darkened. The result was a stiff but serviceable leather used for the soles of brogues, for straps and harness, for the bags used to carry meal and salt. Salt was the one commodity that the glen could not produce for itself. It came in from the coast by pack pony, carried over the passes that connected the inland glens to the sea. The coast was not far in miles from many of these inland townships, but the passes were high and the going was slow. The drove paths across the hills had been used for generations. They followed the natural contours, keeping to the ridges where the ground was firm, dropping down into the glens only where water had to be crossed. A pony could carry 200 weight in balanced loads. A train of pack ponies moving in single file over a high pass made a particular sound, the soft thud of their feet on wet ground and the creak of the wooden pack frames. Along the sea coast itself, the work was different in character. The townships that sat above the narrow coastal strips had access to both land and sea. The boats used inshore were small. The most common was a simple clinker-built craft, perhaps 15 feet long, crewed by 2 or 3 men, propelled by oar or by a single square sail of rough linen or hemp cloth. These boats went out for herring when the shoals appeared close inshore, usually from midsummer onward. The men used drift nets, long curtains of loose-meshed netting weighted at the bottom and held up at the top by wooden or bark floats. Setting the net was done at dusk. The boat was rowed out to the area where the shoal was expected. The net was paid out over the stern slowly, and then the boat lay quiet in the water while the men waited. The net drifted with the tide. The herring moved through it in the dark and were caught by their gills in the loose mesh. At first light, the net was hauled back in, heavy with fish, the silver bodies flashing and shaking as they came over the gunwale. The noise of the haul was considerable. The men worked fast and without ceremony. The herring caught close inshore were gutted and split the same morning. The gutting knife was short-bladed and curved, and a skilled worker moved through the fish quickly. The cleaned herring were layered into wooden barrels with dry salt between each layer. The salt was the expensive material. The barrel was sealed and left to cure. Some fish were smoked rather than salted, hung in the rafters of a small stone hut, where a fire of green wood and seaweed was kept burning low for several days. The result was a fish that would keep for weeks without spoiling, and that could be carried inland to the glen townships in those same pack creels that came back from the coast empty after delivering their loads of leather, horn, or wool. The rhythm of all this work was governed by the light. The days in midsummer were very long this far north. The sky did not go fully dark. Work could continue into the late evening because there was light enough to see. In winter, the reverse was true. The working day contracted sharply. There were only a few hours of usable light. Much of what could be done was done inside, by the fire, in the glow of a rushlight dipped in tallow, or a small lamp burning fish oil in a stone dish. The longhouse itself was the center of this world. It was a low building of stone and turf, its walls thick enough to stand against the wind coming down off the mountain. The roof was of turf laid over a timber frame, or sometimes of heather thatch secured with weighted ropes. The floor was beaten earth. The fire burned in the middle of the main room, or sometimes against one end wall, with no chimney but a hole left in the roof above to let the smoke find its way out. The cattle occupied the far end of the same building, separated from the living space by a low partition. Their warmth contributed to the warmth of the whole. Inside, in the evening after the work was done, the fire burned with a low, steady glow. The peat gave off little flame but considerable heat, and a sweet, heavy smell that settled into everything it touched. The walls were dark with years of smoke. The furniture was minimal. There was a wooden box bed built against the wall, filled with heather and covered with the same heavy plaid cloth that served as a blanket. There was a wooden stool or two. There was a three-legged iron pot suspended over the fire on a chain fixed to the roof timber. The meal for the evening was already made. The fire has been burning since before dawn. It sits in the center of the floor on a flat hearthstone, and its smoke rises slowly toward the thatch above. There is no chimney. The smoke finds its way out through the roof, or it does not. By evening, the inside of the roundhouse carries a low gray haze that settles just above a standing person's head. This is an Iron Age roundhouse, built on a hillside somewhere in the Northern Highlands, perhaps near what we now call Sutherland or Caithness. The year might be anywhere between 500 and 200 years before the Common Era. The walls are stone at the base, then turf, then a frame of timber poles supporting the cone of the roof. The roof is thatched with heather or straw, packed thick enough to keep out the rain. The floor is beaten earth. In some houses it is covered with rushes cut from the bog at the edge of the settlement. The rushes are changed when they become too dirty or too damp. In the meantime, they hold the smell of the animals and the smell of the cooking and the smell of the people who live here. There are perhaps 6 or 8 people in this household. The floor space is roughly circular and perhaps 12 meters across. The central fire is the most important thing in the house. It is kept burning at all times. Letting it go out is a serious matter, because relighting it requires effort, and because the fire is also warmth and light and the means of cooking. The fuel is peat, cut from the nearby bog in long rectangular blocks and dried through the summer. Peat burns slowly and steadily. It does not crackle much. It gives off a dense, sweet-smelling smoke that coats the thatch above and preserves it against rot. Around the inside wall, there is a low platform of timber or packed earth, perhaps 30 centimeters high. This is where the family sleeps. They sleep on this raised area, on beds of heather or dried bracken covered with animal skins. The skins are from cattle and deer, and they have been prepared by scraping and softening until they are supple enough to lie on or under. In winter, several people sleep close together for warmth. There is no privacy to speak of. The sleeping platform runs most of the way around the inside of the wall. The space between the sleeping platform and the central fire is the working and living area. During the day, this is where grain is ground, where leather is worked, where tools are repaired. The grinding is done on a saddle quern, a flat stone with a smaller stone that is pushed back and forth across it. Grinding grain is slow work. A woman grinding enough barley for the day's food might spend an hour at the task. The rotary quern, which is easier to use, does not arrive in the Highlands until later, probably around the 1st century before the Common Era. The grain being ground is mostly barley. Some households also have oats and emmer wheat, but barley is the staple. It is grown in small, hand-dug plots on the more sheltered slopes around the settlement. The plots are worked with wooden adze, a simple ploughing tool that scratches the surface of the soil without turning it. The soil in the highlands is thin and acidic, and the growing season is short. What grows, grows slowly. The barley is made into a thick porridge or into flatbreads, baked on a stone set close to the fire. The porridge is cooked in a clay pot or in a wooden container by dropping heated stones into the liquid. This is called pot boiling with fire stones, and it is one of the oldest cooking methods in use in these settlements. The heated stones bring the water to a boil quickly enough to cook the grain. The clay pots are heavy, round-bottomed vessels with simple decoration pressed into the surface before firing. There is also meat. The household keeps cattle, sheep, and pigs. The cattle are smaller than modern breeds. They are a hardy, shaggy type suited to the upland pastures. They are kept alive through the winter if possible, but in late autumn some animals are slaughtered because there is not enough stored fodder to feed them all. The meat is salted or smoked to preserve it. Salt comes from coastal settlements, traded inland. Smoked meat hangs from the roof timbers above the fire, where the smoke cures it slowly over days and weeks. Milk is important. The cattle that survive the winter provide milk from spring onward. The milk is drunk fresh, or it is turned into butter and cheese. Butter is made by shaking milk in a skin pouch. Cheese is made by curdling the milk with rennet taken from the stomach of a young animal. Both butter and cheese can be stored, and both add fat to a diet that would otherwise be very lean through the winter months. Fish is eaten by households near the coast or near rivers. In Caithness and along the firths, people take salmon, sea trout, and herring. They use wicker traps set in the shallows of rivers and small boats on the open water. The boats are skin-covered frames, light enough for one man to carry, called hide boats or curras. They are paddled rather than rowed, and they sit low in the water. On a calm morning, before the wind comes up, they can move quietly and quickly across a sheltered bay. Hazelnuts are gathered from the scrubby woodland that still covers the lower slopes. Wild garlic grows along the streamsides and is eaten in spring when fresh plant food is scarce. Berries are collected in late summer. Brambles, crowberries, and bog bilberries all grow in this landscape. They are eaten fresh or dried for storage. None of this foraging is incidental. It is a planned and necessary part of the food year. The children of the household are put to work early. A child of 6 or 7 might be responsible for keeping the smaller animals from straying or for carrying water from the nearest spring. The spring is perhaps 100 meters from the roundhouse, uphill or downhill, depending on the lie of the land. Water is carried in pottery vessels or in wooden containers sealed with pine resin. Children do not go to any kind of formal schooling. They learn by watching and doing. Clothing for both adults and children is made from wool. The sheep kept by these households produce a coarse, short staple fleece that is plucked rather than sheared in the early period. The wool is cleaned, combed, and then spun on a drop spindle. The drop spindle is a weighted stick that is twisted and allowed to hang, drawing out and twisting the wool fibers as it drops. Spinning is done by women and older girls, often while doing other things, while tending the fire or watching the children or sitting in the doorway of the roundhouse in better weather. The spun yarn is woven on an upright warp-weighted loom. The loom stands against the inside wall of the house. The weights that keep the warp threads taut are small clay rings, each with a hole through the center, and they hang in rows from the lower edge of the weaving. The finished cloth is a plain weave, sometimes in a simple check pattern made by alternating 2 colors of wool. The dyes come from plants and lichens. Weld gives yellow, woad gives blue. Certain lichens found on the upland rocks give shades of rust and orange. A completed garment is a rectangular length of cloth, pinned at the shoulder with a bronze brooch and belted at the waist. Men and women both wear this style. The garment reaches to the knee or below. Under it there may be a simple linen undergarment, though linen requires flax, which does not grow easily in the highland climate and must be obtained through exchange. In winter, a heavier outer wrap is added. Shoes are made from untanned leather, cut and stitched into a simple moccasin shape and tied at the ankle. Bronze is present in these households, though it is not common. A family of ordinary means might own 1 or 2 bronze pins, a small knife with a bronze blade, and perhaps a bracelet or armlet. Iron begins to appear in Highland settlements from around 600 years before the Common Era, though it arrives later here than in the south of Britain. An iron knife is a valuable thing. It holds an edge better than bronze. It is repaired by a smith who works in the settlement or travels between settlements. The roundhouse has 1 door. The door faces away from the prevailing wind, which in most Highland locations means it faces east or southeast. The door is a timber frame with a wicker panel or a skin hanging. There is no lock. A wooden bar can be dropped across the inside of the frame. The threshold is slightly raised to keep surface water from running in. In wet weather, the area just inside the door becomes the muddiest part of the floor. Animals are sometimes brought inside the roundhouse in winter. The pigs and some of the smaller cattle may occupy a section at the back of the interior, separated from the human living space by a low partition of wicker or timber. Their body heat contributes to the warmth of the house. The smell is considerable. The presence of animals inside the home is simply a practical arrangement. The winter in the northern highlands is long and the cold is serious, and the animals are too valuable to lose. Light inside the roundhouse is poor. The fire gives some light, but it is unsteady and concentrated. Rush lights are made by soaking the pith of dried rush stems in animal fat. They burn for perhaps an hour and give a small, wavering flame. They are used when people need to see to work in the evening. Mostly, the household rises with the light and sleeps when it grows dark. In midsummer, this means very little sleep in the short northern nights. In midwinter, it means very little waking time. Water, fire, food, and warmth. These are the four things that the household organizes itself around. The year is divided by the demands of the animals and the fields. Spring means the cattle going out to the higher pastures. Late summer means the harvest of grain and the gathering of the autumn foods. Winter means staying close, burning the stored peat, eating the stored food, repairing tools and clothing, waiting. The settlement this roundhouse belongs to has perhaps 4 or 5 other similar houses clustered nearby. They are connected by worn paths across the ground. The people in these houses are related by blood or marriage. They work some land together and some land separately. They share tasks that require more than one family's effort. The building or rethatching of a roundhouse is one such task. It requires many hands over several days, and it is done in summer when the weather allows. The landscape around the settlement is not wild in the way we might now picture it. There are cleared fields. There are worn animal paths leading to the water source. There are middens, heaps of refuse, at the edge of the occupied area, containing ash, broken pottery, animal bones, and shells from the coast if the settlement is near enough to trade for them. The middens are important to us now because they preserve evidence of what was eaten and used. At the time, they are simply where rubbish is put. The trees nearest the settlement have been heavily used. Timber for building, for fuel, for tool handles, for the frames of the wicker panels, all of it comes from the nearby woodland. Hazel is coppiced, cut back to the stump on a regular cycle so that it produces long, straight rods that can be woven into panels. Birch and alder grow along the wetter ground near the stream. Oak, where it exists, is the most valuable timber and is used for the main structural posts of larger buildings. Children born into this household face significant risk in their first years. Evidence from skeletal remains found at Iron Age sites across Scotland suggests that childhood illness and malnutrition are common. A child who survives to the age of 10 has a reasonable chance of reaching adulthood. Adults who reach the age of 30 or 35 are considered old by the standards of their time. The bones of older adults from these sites show signs of hard physical work. Arthritis is common. Dental wear from the grit in stone-ground grain is almost universal. The dead are treated with care. Burial practices in the Highland Iron Age vary. Some communities bury their dead in stone-lined grave called cists, which are sunk into the ground near the settlement or sometimes beneath the floor of a house. Others expose the dead or use other methods that leave fewer traces in the ground. Grave goods found in cist burials from this period and region include pottery vessels, small personal ornaments, and occasionally tools. The presence of grave goods suggests that something is placed with the dead for a reason, though what that reason is, we cannot say with certainty. Evening in the roundhouse. The fire has been banked down with a layer of ash to keep it slow through the night. The last of the day's bread has been eaten. The animals at the back of the house shift and settle. The smoke hangs steady in the roof space. Outside, the sky over the hills is deep and the cattle are settled for the night. A thin light still holds along the western ridge, the kind that lingers in the highlands long past what southerners would call evening. In the glen below, the last of the day's fire is being banked with peat. The smoke drifts flat across the ground before rising. It is the close of an ordinary day, somewhere in the northern highlands, in the early medieval period, perhaps the 8th or 9th century. The settlement is a small cluster of round houses and rectangular longhouses, built close together on slightly raised ground above the flood line of the river. The walls are of dry stone and turf, the roofs thatched with heather or bent grass. There may be 6 or 8 families here, perhaps 40 people in total. They share the high pasture in summer and the low fields in winter. They know one another completely. Community life in these settlements was not organized around a town square or a market street. It was organized around shared necessity. The shieling, the field, the fishing pool, the peat bank. These were the places where people gathered, because these were the places where the work was. A man cutting peat on the hill would work alongside his neighbor for days at a time. A woman spinning wool by the door of her house was visible to the whole settlement. Life happened in the open or in one another's hearth rooms, and there was very little that was private. The rhythm of the week had a shape, but it was not the rigid shape of later centuries. Sunday was observed as a day of rest from at least the time of the Columban Church, which spread through the western highlands and islands from Iona after the late 6th century. Columba himself is said to have emphasized the keeping of the Sabbath, though the records are partial and the enforcement was nothing like what came later. In these early settlements, Sunday rest was real but relative. Animals still needed feeding, water still needed carrying, the fire could not be left to go out. What changed on a Sunday was the character of the gathering. People came together. In a settlement with its own chapel or oratory, which by the 8th century might be a small stone cell no larger than a modern garden shed, the community would assemble for prayer in the morning. A priest might be present or might not. The Columban tradition allowed for a degree of lay leadership in small communities. The service would be short. The psalms were sung slowly, without accompaniment. Then the day opened up into something slower than a working day, though not empty. The feast days of the church calendar gave the year its larger structure. Christmas was observed, though in the early medieval period it was not the dominant feast it later became. Easter was the central event of the Christian year, and in the Highlands, the calculation of its date had once been a matter of serious controversy. The Celtic Church had used a different method of calculation from Rome, and the dispute lasted until the Synod of Whitby in 664 and was not fully resolved in all parts of Scotland until the early 8th century. For ordinary people in a Highland glen, the theological argument was distant. What mattered was the fast before Easter and the feast after it. The Feast of Samhain, at the end of October, was another gathering point. It sat at the boundary between the old pastoral calendar and the Christian year, and in the Highlands the two were never cleanly separated. Samhain marked the end of the summer grazing season. The cattle came down from the high ground. Animals that could not be kept through winter were slaughtered. The meat was salted or dried. There was more food available at Samhain than at almost any other point in the year, which meant there was more eating, more company, more fire. The Feast of Beltane, at the start of May, was its mirror. The cattle went back up to the sheilings. Fires were lit, sometimes on the hilltops, as they had been lit long before Christianity arrived. The Church absorbed these moments rather than erasing them. By the early medieval period, Beltane had no formal church sanction, but it persisted in the Highlands with a tenacity that suggests it was doing something the church calendar alone could not do. It was marking the land itself, not just the soul. Markets in the early medieval Highlands were not permanent fixtures. There was no high street, no market town in the modern sense. Exchange happened at the edges of other gatherings. After a church feast, when people from several settlements had come together in one place, goods moved between hands. A man might bring surplus cheese, or a length of woven cloth, or a tool he had made through the winter. He would leave with something he needed. The transaction was often by barter, though silver was not unknown in the Highlands by the 9th century, and hacksilver, small cut pieces weighed rather than counted, circulated in exchange. The fair, as a more formal institution, developed gradually. By the later medieval period, certain locations in the Highlands had established fairs that drew people from considerable distances. The tryst at Crieff, which became one of the great cattle markets of Scotland, did not reach its peak until the late 17th century, but the habit of gathering cattle and driving them to a fixed point for exchange is much older. The drove roads themselves follow lines that were worn into the landscape over centuries. In the earlier period, the gathering point was more likely to be associated with a church or a monastic site. The monastery at Applecross, founded by Maelrubha in 673 on the western coast of Ross, became a centre not only of religious life, but of the practical life of the surrounding region. People came to Applecross for feast days and for justice, and for the settling of disputes. They came because the monastery had standing in the community that went beyond the spiritual. It held land, it kept records, it trained craftsmen. The church site was often the most permanent structure in a landscape of seasonal and semi-permanent habitation. A stone chapel that had stood for 3 generations was a fixed point in a world where families might shift their settlement by a quarter-mile over the course of a lifetime. People were buried at church sites, and the grave of ancestors held a community to a place as firmly as any legal document. To be buried with your kin at the old chapel in the valley was to belong there. The gathering after a burial was itself a community event. The body was carried to the grave by the men of the settlement. The women prepared food. After the burial, people ate and drank together, sometimes for the better part of a day. This was not frivolity. It was the community reconstituting itself around the loss. It was also one of the few occasions when people from different settlements would come together in numbers, because kin were spread across several glens, and a death called them in. Hospitality was both a social obligation and a moral one. In the early Gaelic-speaking world of the Highlands, the duty to feed and shelter a traveller was embedded in law as well as custom. The Brehon law tradition, which had parallels in both Ireland and early Scotland, placed the obligation of hospitality on householders, and particularly on men of rank. A chief who failed to provide generously for guests lost standing in a way that was measurable and real. Generosity was not a personal virtue so much as a public performance of proper lordship. The hall of a local chief was the gathering place for the upper tier of this society. It would have been the largest building in any settlement, built to accommodate not just the chief's household, but the men who owed him service, the poets who preserved his lineage, the visiting clerics who needed lodging. In the evenings, after the meal, there was music. The harp, the classic in Gaelic, was the instrument of the hall. A skilled harper travelled with powerful patrons and performed for their guests. The repertoire included praise poetry, genealogical verse, and narrative songs. For ordinary people in smaller settlements, the gathering at the end of a working day was around the fire of the largest house. This was not a formal arrangement. It was simply where the warmth was, where the conversation was, where the stories were. The oral tradition in the Highlands was not a performance put on for special occasions. It was the texture of evening. An old man or woman who knew the old stories was a resource, consulted and listened to in the same way a craftsman was consulted for practical knowledge. The working week in a Highland settlement followed the agricultural calendar closely. Spring ploughing, with a simple wooden ard pulled by oxen, happened in March and April. The laysibes, those characteristic ridged cultivation strips still visible as earthworks in many Highland glens, were dug by hand with a cast-chrome, a foot plough with an angled blade. The crops were mainly bearer barley and oats. Both were suited to the short growing season and the thin, acid soils of the uplands. The harvest in August and September was the most intensive communal labor of the year. Everyone who could work, worked. The grain was cut with small iron sickles and gathered into sheaves. It was dried carefully because a wet harvest meant a hungry winter. The grain was stored in a small stone building, the grain store, separate from the house, to reduce the risk of a single fire destroying both. The drying kiln, a small stone-lined pit with a fire beneath a perforated floor, was used to finish the drying of grain before milling. The quernstone was in almost every household. Two circular stones, the upper rotated by hand over the lower, ground the grain into meal. This was daily work, done by women in the morning, producing just enough meal for the day's bread and porridge. The sound of a quern turning was the sound of an early morning in a Highland settlement. It was unremarkable background, the way traffic noise is background in a modern town. Water mills existed in Scotland from an early period. The horizontal mill, a simple design with a wheel lying flat in the stream rather than vertical, was common in Scotland and Ireland by the early medieval period. A mill serving several communities was a social node as much as a practical one. People waited for their grain to be ground. They talked while they waited. A mill on a burn in a Highland glen was one of the few places where people from different settlements met regularly without any particular ceremony. The Sunday that followed a heavy harvest week had a different quality from a Sunday in the long slack days of February. In harvest time, the rest was real rest. Bodies that had been bent over sickles for days were glad to straighten. The morning service at the chapel was followed by an afternoon of sitting in the low sun, if there was any sun, or under the shelter of the longhouse eaves. Children played on the open ground between the buildings. Food from the harvest, fresh and plentiful, was shared. The church calendar gave names to the turning points of the year, but the landscape gave the actual structure. The first frost on the high ground told you more reliably than any calendar date that it was time to bring the cattle down. The first lapwings in the valley floor in late February told you that the ground was beginning to soften. The behavior of the red deer on the hill, moving lower as the weather hardened, was read carefully by people who depended on hunting to supplement a diet that was otherwise narrow. The diet was narrow by later standards. Oatmeal porridge was the staple. Bearer bannocks, unleavened flatbreads cooked on a hearthstone, were eaten daily. Dairy produce, particularly crowdy, a soft, fresh cheese made from the summer milk, was important through the grazing season. Meat was less common than it is often imagined, because animals were too valuable as productive animals to slaughter casually. The exception was the autumn cull at Sown and the occasional taking of wild game. Fish were important wherever a settlement was close to a river or the sea. The rivers of the Highlands, the Tay, the Spey, the Bowley, the Cannon, held salmon in numbers that are difficult to imagine now. Salmon were netted and trapped at weirs, wooden or stone structures built across a river to funnel fish into an enclosure. The salmon taken in autumn could be dried or smoked to last through winter. A settlement near a good salmon river had a significant advantage over one dependent only on grain and cattle. The social hierarchies of the highland world were visible in small things. The quality of a man's cloak, whether his brooch was of iron or of silver, whether he sat near the fire or further away. These distinctions mattered, and they were read by everyone present without anything needing to be said. The chief's household ate better, dressed better, and occupied more of the best ground. But the distance between a chief and his freemen was not the vast gulf it became in later feudal structures. A free farmer in the early medieval Highlands had. The peat is cooling now. The last light has gone from the western ridges. Somewhere below, the River Spey is moving in the dark, carrying snowmelt from the Cairngorm Plateau down toward the Murray coast. It has been doing this for thousands of years. The river does not slow for the season. In the centuries before the first century of the Common Era, the Highland landscape looked very different from any image a modern traveller might carry. The Great Caledonian pine forest still covered much of the interior. It ran in dense, unbroken stands from Strathspey westward into Wester Ross and north into Sutherland. The trees were Scots pine, rowan, birch, and alder. They grew close together on the lower slopes, thinning only where the ground turned to blanket bog or exposed rock above 600 feet. That forest was not silent. It carried red squirrel, wolf, brown bear, and lynx. Wild boar moved through the understory, rooting in the deep leaf mold. Beavers worked the smaller streams, damming the tributaries of rivers like the Bowley and the Findhorn. The rivers themselves were thick with Atlantic salmon. They ran so densely in late summer that a man could wade into the shallows and take fish by hand. This was not unusual. It was simply how the rivers were. A generation before the early centuries of the Common Era, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries before the Romans reached the Antonine Line, the forest coverage was even greater. The upland glens were largely uncleared. Settlement was sparse and clustered near the coast and the broader straths. People lived close to running water. They needed it for drinking, for processing animal hides, for soaking grain. The small communities along Strath Dean and Strath Nain were positioned deliberately beside streams that ran clear and cold year-round. By the time the early centuries of the Common Era arrived, clearance had begun in earnest. Not the large-scale clearance of a much later age, but a steady, generation-by-generation removal of trees to create grazing land and small arable plots. Around Loch Ness, the lower slopes had been opened up enough to grow emmer wheat and barley in patches of cultivated ground. The soil was thin and acidic, but manageable close to the loch shore, where alluvial deposits had built up over centuries of flooding. The moorland that covers so much of the Highlands today did not exist in its present form then. Much of what became open heather moor was still forest or scrubby secondary growth, where forest had been removed a generation earlier. Heather dominated only on the higher ground and on the exposed Atlantic-facing slopes of the western seaboard. The interior was darker and wetter and more enclosed. Walking through it would have meant pushing through undergrowth, not striding across open ground. The blanket bogs were already ancient. They had been forming since the end of the last ice age, accumulating peat in some places to depths of several meters. On the flow country of what is now Caithness and Sutherland, the bog stretched without interruption for miles. In winter, it was frozen across its surface. In spring, it became treacherous, full of pools hidden beneath pale grass and sphagnum moss. Cattle learned to avoid the wettest ground, so did people. The cattle of this period were small and dark. They were descended from the aurochs, but much reduced in size after generations of selective keeping in confined conditions. A Highland cow of the early centuries stood perhaps 4 feet at the shoulder. It was heavily built for its size, with a thick coat adapted to the wet and cold. It grazed on coarse grass, sedge, and heather shoots. It was kept primarily for its milk and its blood, both of which were consumed directly. Slaughter for meat was selective and often seasonal. Sheep were present too, though in smaller numbers than cattle. The early sheep of the Highlands were a short-tailed, primitive breed with kempi mixed fiber fleeces not well suited to fine spinning. They were kept in mixed flocks with goats on the steeper ground. Goats were more useful on rocky terrain and required less supervision. A small herd of goats could be left on a hillside above a settlement for several days without being brought in. Sheep required more management. The seasonal pattern of livestock keeping shaped everything about how people moved across the landscape. In late spring, around the end of May, cattle were moved up to the higher summer pastures, the sheilings. These were temporary grazing grounds, often 6 or 7 miles from the main settlement. Young women and older children went with the animals. They stayed in small stone or turf shelters. They made cheese and butter from the milk. This practice was already old by the early centuries. It had been established long enough to be entirely unremarkable. In October, the animals came back down. The grass on the higher ground was finished. Frost was already settling on the Cairngorm tops by the first week of October, sometimes earlier. The cattle were brought into enclosures near the settlement for the winter. Some were housed in buildings alongside people. This was practical, not sentimental. The body heat of the animals helped to warm the interior. The building smelled of dung and wet hide, but it was warm. The rivers were the roads of the Highlands. The Spey, the Bowley, the Glass, the Ness, the Findhorn, the Nairn, the Diveran, and the Don all ran roughly from southwest to northeast, draining the interior plateau toward the Murray Firth. They were navigable for short distances by small flat-bottomed craft, but the upper reaches were too fast and too shallow for any practical river transport. Movement followed the river valleys on foot or with pack animals along the banks. The Murray Firth itself was a working body of water. Its southern shore, from Inverness east to the headland above Nairn, was lined with small natural harbours and beach landings. These were not constructed harbours with stone piers. They were places where the beach shelved gently and a small wooden craft could be drawn up above the tide line. Fishing from these places was year-round. Cod, saithe, herring and flatfish were taken close inshore. Dried or salted fish could be stored through winter and traded inland along the valley routes. A generation earlier, the same shoreline had seen less systematic use. The fishing was opportunistic. By the early centuries of the Common Era, it had become more organized, with specific families or groups holding customary rights to particular stretches of coast. This was not written law. It was understood by everyone and rarely disputed. A stranger who set nets on a beach where another group fished would simply find those nets moved or removed. The western sea locks presented a different kind of water. Loch Broom, Loch Torridon, Loch Alsh, and the Sound of Sleat were all used for fishing and for movement along the coast. The sea locks cut deep into the mainland, allowing salt water to reach far inland. At the head of Loch Broom, the water was calm enough most days to cross in a small hide-covered boat. The tidal currents in the narrows between the mainland and the islands of the inner sound were fast and required careful navigation, but they were known currents, studied over generations. The islands closest to the mainland, Skye, Mull, and the smaller islands of the Inner Hebrides were not isolated places. They were connected by water. Movement between the mainland and Skye across the Kyle of Lochalsh was routine. The crossing was less than a mile at its narrowest. Cattle were swum across in summer. People crossed in boats at most states of the tide. The distinction between island and mainland was less significant than it would later become. West of the main ridge of the Highlands, the landscape was defined by exposed rock, thin soil, and constant wind off the Atlantic. The Torridonian sandstone mountains of Wester Ross were already ancient beyond reckoning. They had been shaped into their present form long before any human being walked in Scotland. By the early centuries of the Common Era, they supported only sparse grassland on their lower flanks, with heather and crowberry above. Nothing grew on the summit plateaus. They were bare red and grey rock, stained with lichen, scoured by winter gales. The Great Glen was the single most important geographical feature in the Highland interior. It ran in an almost straight line from Inverness in the northeast to Fort William in the southwest, a distance of roughly 60 miles. It followed a geological fault line and contained, along its length, Loch Ness, Loch Oich, and Loch Lochy. These three lochs were connected by short river stretches. Loch Ness alone was 23 miles long and over 700 feet deep in places. It never froze. Even in the coldest winters, the volume of water retained enough heat to keep the surface liquid. The communities along the Great Glen used the loch shore and the flat ground at the river mouths for settlement. They kept to the lower ground. The sides of the glen rose steeply to over 2,000 feet on both flanks, and in winter those upper slopes were impassable. Travel along the glen floor in winter was possible in dry conditions, but difficult in wet weather, when the small burns that ran down the hillsides became wide and fast. In spring, the melt from the high ground could turn those same burns into temporary torrents in a matter of hours. North of the Great Glen, the landscape opened into something broader and lower. The Black Isle, which is not an island but a broad peninsula between the Cromarty Firth and the Bowley Firth, carried some of the best agricultural land in the Highlands. The soil there was derived from old red sandstone and was deeper and more fertile than the thin soils of the interior. Barley grew well on the Black Isle. So did the leafy plants used for cooking and for medicine, including various members of the goosefoot family that grew on disturbed ground near settlements. The Cromarty Firth was sheltered enough to support boats of a larger size than those used on the exposed western coast. It was wide and deep, with a narrow entrance at the Suitors, two headlands of old red sandstone that compressed the tidal flow into a fast but navigable channel. Inside the firth, the water was calmer. The mudflats at its head, near the mouth of the River Cannon, were rich in shellfish. Oysters, mussels, and cockles were gathered there seasonally. They were an important source of food, particularly in late winter when other supplies were running low. A generation before the early centuries of the Common Era, the population of the entire Highland region was small. Estimates are difficult and should always be treated cautiously, but the number of people living in the glens, on the coasts, and around the lochs was likely measured in tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. The landscape absorbed them. Settlement was scattered. The distance between one community and the next, measured in a day's walking, was often significant. In the deeper glens of Ross and Cromarty, or along the upper reaches of the Dee, a person might walk for 2 days without encountering another settlement. By the early centuries of the Common Era, that spacing had begun to close slightly. Clearance had opened more ground. The population had grown modestly. Communities that had previously been isolated were developing regular contact with their neighbors through trade, through marriage, and through shared use of seasonal pastures. The sheilings on the high ground between adjacent glens brought groups together in summer who might not otherwise meet. This was one of the mechanisms by which the Highland communities remained connected across a difficult terrain. The pollen record from loch sediments across the Highlands shows what the landscape held and when it changed. At Loch Sabhale in Easter Ross, the pollen sequence shows a decline in tree pollen and a rise in grass pollen beginning around the early first millennium before the Common Era. The Scots pine retreats in the record. Plantain, which grows on disturbed ground, increases. This is the signature of people clearing land, grazing animals, and breaking soil. It is recorded not in any document, but in the microscopic grains settled into the mud at the bottom of a still Highland loch. The wind came off the North Atlantic without obstruction. It arrived at the western seaboard already carrying salt and moisture from hundreds of miles of open ocean. It struck the Torridonian Mountains and rose sharply, dropping its rain on the western slopes. The eastern highlands were drier as a result. Nairn on the Murray coast received far less rainfall each year than Torridon, 60 miles to the west as the crow flies. This difference shaped everything: what crops could grow, where cattle could winter, where settlements clustered, where the forest thinned and the moor began. The land was never uniform. It was a series of different places, each with its own character, each demanding a different way of living from the people who stayed in it. The communities on the Murray shore did not live as the communities on Loch Torridon lived. The tools were similar, the seasons were the same, but the water, the soil. The sun drops behind the ridge sometime around the 8th hour of the day, depending on the season. In midsummer it lingers, a long copper light lying flat across the heather. In the short days of November, it is gone by mid-afternoon, and the glen fills with a blue-grey shadow that rises from the valley floor upward. The hills themselves are not yet the hills we know. The tree line sits higher than it will in later centuries. Stands of Scots pine, birch, and alder run well up the lower slopes. The higher ground above the tree line is open bog and heather, with outcrops of grey schist pushing through. The glen floor is wet. It has always been wet. Channels of dark water cut between tussocks of rushes and coarse grass. The settlement sits on slightly raised ground, positioned carefully above the flood line of the river. There are perhaps 8 or 10 roundhouses grouped loosely together. Each one is built from timber posts, its walls packed with wattle and turf, its roof thatched with heather and rushes cut from the valley floor. The roofs are steep. They have to be steep to shed the rain. The eaves come low, almost to shoulder height at the edge, and the whole structure sits close to the ground, as if pressing itself down against the wind. The last of the fieldwork has ended. The people working the infield strips have come back along the edge of the slope. They carry hoes and digging sticks. Some carry wooden rakes with tines cut from hazel branches. The tools are heavy and worn smooth from years of use. They are leaned against the outer wall of the nearest house, or laid on the flat stone by the entrance. The cattle are already moving on their own. They have learned the path from the upper grazing ground back down to the enclosure beside the settlement. They move in a loose group, their breath visible now in the cooling air. A boy of perhaps 10 years walks behind them, tapping the flanks of those that slow. He does not speak. He does not need to. The cattle know the way. The enclosure is a low wall of stacked stone and timber stakes. It is not designed to hold cattle against a serious attempt to leave. It is designed to mark the boundary and to slow any animal that wanders in the night. The boy pulls a section of brushwood across the gap and lodges a stake against it. That is enough. The light on the eastern hillside above the settlement is still pale gold. The western slope is already in deep shadow. This is the particular quality of the Highland dusk, the way the shadow falls in layers, the lit ground and the dark ground existing at the same time across the same short distance. The birch trees at the edge of the settlement catch the last light in their upper branches. The lower trunks are already dark. Inside the largest of the roundhouses, the fire has not gone out. It never goes out if the family can help it. The fire sits in a shallow pit at the center of the floor. The floor itself is packed earth, hard and dark from years of use. There is no chimney. The smoke rises and filters out through the thatch above, through gaps left deliberately in the roof structure. The underside of the thatch is black with years of soot. That blackness keeps away insects and slows the rot of the organic material. The fire is made up now for the evening. Fresh peat has been laid on. Peat burns slowly and holds its heat. It was cut from the bog above the settlement in late spring, stacked to dry through the summer, and carried down in large wicker baskets before the autumn rains came. A family needs a great deal of peat. The cutting and drying of it takes many weeks of work spread across the year. A woman is crouching at the edge of the fire. She is working a clay pot that sits directly on the embers. The pot contains a thick broth of hulled emmer wheat and dried wild garlic and small pieces of salted meat from a pig killed in the autumn. The salt came from the coast, traded through several pairs of hands before it reached this settlement. It is used carefully. Nothing is wasted. The smell of the broth moves through the house and out through the low entrance. Outside, it mixes with the smell of the cattle, with the smell of wet earth and bruised heather, with the smoke that hangs flat in the still evening air. These smells together are the smell of the settlement at the end of the day. They are unremarkable to the people who live here. They are simply the air. Another woman sits closer to the wall, her back against a wooden post that supports the roof ring. She is spinning. The spindle whorl is a small disc of carved bone, and the thread she is making is from the wool of the sheep kept on the upper slopes. The sheep here are small, and their fleece is coarse. The thread she produces will be used for weaving cloth that is worn close to the skin in winter. It is not fine cloth. It is dense and warm and heavy. The men come in from outside in ones and twos. They move to the fire and crouch or sit. Their hands are dirty from the day. They do not wash them. There is no vessel of water set aside for washing at the end of the working day. The idea of washing before eating is not a practice here. The hands are rubbed against the thighs to knock off the loose soil. That is all. One of the older men is repairing a wooden handle. He has a small stone blade, carefully worked, hafted into a wooden grip bound with a strip of dried rawhide. He draws the blade along the wood in short, careful strokes, working by the firelight. The firelight is enough for close work if you sit near enough. People here see well in low light. They have always lived by fire and by the slow dusk. The children are not sent away. There is nowhere to send them and no reason to. They sit near the adults, or they move between the adults and the edge of the firelight. A small child of perhaps 3 years sits in the lap of the older man with the stone blade. It watches his hands. It says nothing. It will fall asleep there and be moved to its sleeping place later. The sleeping places are around the edge of the roundhouse, against the inner wall. They are raised slightly above the floor on low wooden platforms packed with dried bracken and covered with animal hides. The hides are from cattle and red deer. The cattle hides are larger and heavier. The deer hides are used for finer work. In winter, everyone sleeps close together. The body heat of the group is part of how the space is kept warm. Outside, the last of the light is leaving the upper birch branches. The sky above the ridge is a deep greenish blue in the north. In the south, it is already fully dark. The stars begin to show first in the south and east, single bright points appearing before the darkness has fully settled. There is no moon yet. The new moon rose last night and set before dark. The sky will be very dark tonight. The sounds of the settlement are changing with the failing light. The birdsong is almost gone. The last calls are from somewhere in the alder wood along the river, a single repeated note that fades and stops. The river itself is always audible. It runs over a shallow gravel bar about 40 paces from the nearest house. In autumn it is higher and louder than in summer. Tonight it is running with a steady, continuous sound, not loud enough to interrupt speech, but always present. A dog is lying outside the entrance to one of the smaller houses. It is a medium-sized animal with a rough, sandy coat. It has lifted its head at some sound from beyond the enclosure wall and is watching the darkness. After a moment, it puts its head back down on its forepaws. Whatever it heard has passed. The dog is not a pet in the way that will be understood later. It works. It helps with the cattle, and it alerts the settlement to the approach of people or animals. It is valued for this. The broth is ready. The woman at the fire ladles it into a wooden bowl using a carved wooden spoon. The bowl is passed to the oldest man first. He takes it and holds it in both hands and drinks from it directly. Then he uses his fingers to take the solid pieces from the bottom of the bowl. The bowl goes around. Everyone eats from the communal pot. There is enough. In late autumn, after the harvest and the autumn slaughter of animals that cannot be kept through the winter, there is usually enough to eat in the evenings. There is also bread. It is a flat bread, more like a thick cake, made from ground emmer wheat mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone beside the fire. The grinding was done that morning on a saddle quern, a long back-and-forth movement that takes time and strength. The women who grind the grain feel it in their lower backs and in their knees. The skeletons found in later centuries at sites not unlike this one show the wear in the bones. The flat bread is dense and slightly gritty from the stone of the quern. It is broken by hand and eaten with the broth. There is nothing else on this particular evening. On some evenings, there might be dried fish if the settlement has traded for it or sent someone to the river or to one of the nearby lochs. On some evenings in summer, there would be curd made from the milk of the cattle. Tonight there is the broth and the bread. The conversation at the fire is quiet. It is the conversation of people who have spent the day in each other's company doing physical work. There is not much news to share. The talk moves slowly, with long silences that no one feels the need to fill. A man says something about the lower field, something about the drainage at the western edge. Another man responds briefly. The older man with the stone blade does not look up from his work. The language spoken here is a very early form of what will eventually become Scottish Gaelic. It shares ancestors with the Celtic languages of Britain and continental Europe. It has words for all the things that matter here, for weather, for the parts of the land, for the conditions of animals, for the stages of grain. It has a large vocabulary of words for bog and for rain. The fire settles lower. The fresh peat has caught fully now and is burning with a steady, almost invisible flame at its surface, more glow than flame, a deep orange at the edges going to grey at the center. This is how a peat fire looks when it is burning well. It does not crackle much. It breathes. The sound of it is almost nothing, just a very faint sighing in the pause between other sounds. The woman spinning has stopped her spindle. She is watching the fire. The thread hangs from her fingers. She is not asleep yet, but she is close to it. The spinning will continue tomorrow morning and the morning after that, through the autumn and into the winter. The cloth she is making will take weeks to produce enough thread, and then more weeks at the loom. Outside the roundhouse, the temperature has dropped sharply in the last half hour. The clear sky is taking the heat out of the land quickly. The grass at the edge of the settlement is stiffening. By morning, there may be a frost on the higher ground. The cattle in the enclosure are standing close together. Their breath makes a slow mist above them that drifts toward the river. The boy who brought the cattle in is now inside by the fire. He has eaten. His eyes are half closed. He is leaning against the wooden post near the entrance. His feet are bare. They have been bare all day. The soles of his feet are thick and hard from a summer of walking without shoes. In winter, he will wear something on his feet, a wrapping of hide secured with cord. The fire is the center of everything in this house. It is the source of warmth and light and cooked food. It is also a kind of presence in itself. The people who live here do not think of it as sacred in any formal sense on an ordinary evening like this one, but they are careful with it. They do not neglect it. The last person to sleep will bank it with fresh peat to hold the heat through the dark hours until morning, when someone will wake before the others and coax it back to flame. The river sounds a little louder now that the settlement has gone quiet. The dog outside has not moved. The sky above the ridge is entirely dark and full of stars, more stars than will ever be visible from this same ground in any century that comes after, because there is no other light for many miles in any direction. The darkness here is complete. The last light goes out of the western sky sometime around the 9th hour. In the glens, that happens quickly. The ridgeline above Loch Ness holds the glow for a few minutes longer than the valley floor, and then that too fades into a deep blue that has no bottom to it. There are no gas lamps here. There are no street torches. There is only the fire inside the roundhouse and the small reddish light that leaks through the gap above the door. The roundhouses sit low against the hillside. They are built of dry stone and turf, roofed with a thick layer of heather thatch that comes down almost to the ground on the windward side. From a distance in the dark, you would not know they were there at all. They look like part of the hill. That is not by accident. The people who built them knew that a house which disappears into the land around it is harder to raid, harder to burn, harder to see from the ridge across the valley. Inside, the central hearth is still burning. It never goes completely out. The fire is the single most important thing in the household, more important than the tools hung on the wall or the grain stored in the back chamber. It is kept alive through the night by banking peat over the embers before the family lies down. Peat burns slowly and holds its heat for hours. The smoke rises through the open apex of the roof, but not all of it escapes. The interior of a roundhouse after dark smells of peat smoke and animal breath, and the lanolin that still sits in the wool of the sleeping rugs. The cattle are inside too in many cases, not in the same chamber as the people, but separated by a low partition of woven hazel. This is not poverty, it is practicality. The warmth the cattle give off is real and measurable. On a November night in the Great Glen, the temperature outside can drop close to freezing before the sky is fully dark. The body heat of 3 or 4 cattle raises the temperature inside the dwelling by several degrees. The family knows this. They have always known this. The cattle shift and breathe through the wall. You can hear the low, wet sound of a cow chewing through the night. It is a steady sound. It does not startle. Children born in these houses sleep through it without waking. It becomes part of the rhythm of the dark, like the sound of rain on the thatch or the movement of the wind across the smoke hole above. Outside, the glen is not entirely silent. There are other sounds, all of them older than the settlement itself. A tawny owl calls from the oak wood above the river. It calls once, waits, and calls again. The river itself is audible from almost anywhere in the valley. In summer, it runs quietly. In late autumn, after the rains have come in off the Atlantic, it carries a low, continuous roar that fills the bottom of the glen and travels up the slopes. The people here have a word for that sound, the sound the river makes in spate, but that word has not survived into any written record. The dogs are outside on clear nights. They are not large dogs by later standards. They are lean, long-legged animals, somewhere between a deerhound and a type that has since disappeared entirely from these islands. They sleep in a loose group near the entrance to the dwelling. They do not need to be told to watch. That instinct is older in them than any training. One of them raises its head now. Something has moved in the bracken on the slope above the house. It listens for a moment. Whatever it was has gone. The dog lowers its head back onto its forelegs and closes its eyes. The path that connects this settlement to the next runs along the eastern bank of the river. You cannot see it now. The cloud cover is almost complete, and the moon, which is in its last quarter, will not rise until well past midnight. The path is made of beaten earth, worn down by feet and by the hooves of cattle driven to and from the summer grazing grounds in the high corries. In places, it is edged with stones to keep it from washing out in wet weather. In places, it disappears entirely into a crossing of boggy ground and must be found again on the other side by memory or by the direction of the water sound. The last person who walked that path tonight came back from the neighboring settlement sometime before dark. He was carrying a tool, a wooden-handled adze with an iron blade, borrowed 2 days before and now returned. The adze is back on its peg inside the house. He pulled off his leather shoes at the door and set them beside the others. His feet were wet. They are nearly always wet this time of year. The shoes are made of single pieces of hide, folded and stitched with a bone awl. They keep the roughest ground from the sole of the foot, but they do not keep out water. The family that lives here numbers 6, 2 adults, 3 children, and an elderly woman who is the mother of the man of the house. She went to sleep earliest, as she always does. She lies wrapped in a sleeping rug made of cattle hide with the hair still on the inside. Her breathing is audible across the room. The children are beside her, nested together for warmth. The smallest one is perhaps 3 years old. The oldest is closer to 10. They have been asleep for some time. The 2 adults are still by the fire. The woman is working by firelight. She is spinning wool onto a drop spindle. The spindle is a simple thing, a wooden shaft weighted at one end with a clay whirl. She draws the raw wool out with her left hand and lets the spindle drop, twisting as it falls. She does this with the ease of something done 10,000 times. She does not look at her hands. She is looking at the fire. The man is repairing a piece of leather harness. He has a bone needle and a length of twisted sinew. The firelight is not generous, but it is enough for close work if you hold the object at the right angle. He works slowly. There is no urgency. The repair needs to be done before the cattle are moved again, and that is still several days away. The grain from the autumn harvest is stored in a chamber at the back of the roundhouse. It sits in large ceramic vessels, round-bottomed pots with applied decoration around the neck. The grain is mostly barley. There is some emmer wheat as well. The barley will be ground on a saddle quern and made into a flatbread cooked directly on a flat stone at the edge of the fire. It will also be malted and brewed into a thin ale. The brewing is done by the woman. It always is. There is a secondary structure a short distance from the main roundhouse. It is smaller, lower, used primarily for storage. It contains the tools and the clay vessels and the dried fish wrapped in bark and the smoked joints of meat hanging from a crossbeam above head height. The door is closed and weighted with a stone. Nothing moves inside it tonight. The hills above the settlement are invisible in the dark. You know they are there because you can feel the weather coming off them, cold and damp, pressing down the valley. The highest points in this part of the Great Glen reach above 900 meters. The snow line in November sits somewhere between 500 and 600 meters, and it has snowed twice already this season. The peaks have been white for 3 weeks. The white is not visible now, but the cold that comes off them is constant and unmistakable. The birch woods on the lower slopes hold the wind back a little. The birch here are not the same as they were 2,000 years before, when the great Caledonian pinewood covered much of this ground. That forest has been contracting for centuries, pushed back by clearance and grazing. The oak and hazel along the riverbank are more recent colonizers of the lower ground. They are dense enough to muffle sound. The owl that called earlier is somewhere inside that wood now. It has gone quiet. The river makes its sound. The dog breathes. The fire inside the roundhouse settles slightly a small collapse of one peat block against another, and a brief brightening of light through the door gap. The woman glances up. Nothing. She goes back to her spindle. The sky to the north has a faint difference to it, not quite light, but a lessening of the absolute dark. It is the kind of sky that appears above a landscape with no human fire in it at all, just the residual luminescence that sometimes gathers at the horizon in high latitudes, even on clouded nights. It is not the aurora. It is simply the sky being the sky. Nobody in the settlement is awake to see it. A fox moves along the far bank of the river. It picks its way between the stones, testing each one before it places its weight. It does not cross to this bank. It continues south, following the water, until it reaches the point where the river bends and the trees close in, and the dark becomes complete. It disappears into that dark without a sound. The settlement has been here for several generations. The present roundhouse was built on the foundations of an earlier one. You can see the earlier wall line where it emerges from the ground on the eastern side, half buried now, stones pushed aside by tree roots. The people who live here know the history of their own place in a way that does not require writing. It is held in the names of fields and in the memory of which winter the old cattle shed fell and which summer the river flooded to the door. The woman finishes the length of wool she was drawing out. She ties off the spindle and sets it down. She looks at the fire for a moment. The man is still working on the harness, turning it to find the last section that needs stitching. The fire is burning low now. She leans forward and places 2 more blocks of peat at the edges of the hearth, where they will dry before catching, and then hold the fire through the rest of the night. This is the last act of the waking day. She does it the same way every night. The peat is cut from the bog above the settlement. The cutting was done in spring when the ground was workable. The blocks were stacked and left to dry through the summer, turned once in July, and then brought down to the house before the first autumn rains. They are dark brown and smell of the deep ground they came from. Each one is roughly the size of a man's forearm. They will burn until. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.